Good afternoon, and I think we will get started now. Um, Welcome to the second webinar in our 2022 Conservation Webinar Series. I am pleased to welcome Dr. Matt Helmers to the webinar. Dr. Helmers has been involved with the Iowa Learning Farms now since the beginning. And as many of you know, Dr. Helmers is the director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. And who better to fill us in on what's happening with field edge practices such as saturated buffers and bioreactors. Matt, welcome. We look forward to hearing your discussion today.
Right. Thanks, Dr. Comito. And I like the other way when I get to host these rather than when I get to give them, because I get to learn something and now I worry whether I will relay any information that's useful. But I'm going to talk today about better utilizing the field edge, saturated buffers, and bioreactors. This is the third in a series of webinars that are talking about some case studies and some resources that are out there for those that might be working with folks thinking about these practices, or educators that might have the opportunity to talk to students or other folks about these practices. So I think there's some great resources, and we'll kind of walk through some of those. So I have to say, if you were hoping to see all kinds of graphs of data, I will understand if you log off now. That's not the point of this presentation. We'll have some in the future, some webinars in the future that likely do more of that with saturated buffers and bioreactors. So this is part of this case studies, part of a joint project of Iowa State University and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. As I said, this one is part of 4 watershed-based conservation case studies. Mark Lick talked about one on infield management back, I think, in August. Kay Stefanik and Adam Jenke talked about wetlands here more recently. And then Mark Licht is going to give another one on redefining the field edge. If I'm not mistaken, that's the next one that would be coming. Okay, so these watershed-based conservation case studies are everything I'm going to talk about today. It's really available for download and for your use. And I think there's some very nice publications, visually appealing and understandable. And so the first one, there's the resources, the overview booklet for educators, the overview booklet for students, and some additional information booklet for students. Those are at the conservationlearninggroup.org/training. So the watershed-based conservation case studies. So everything we'll talk about, you'll be able to find there and download whatever you would like. Okay, let's see. Okay, so kind of to walk through these case studies, these give an overview of the problem and what the introduction to the case study, and then what the student knowledge, the student prior knowledge should be prior to getting into one of these case studies. So basic understanding of watersheds and how water, soil, and nutrients move, some basic understanding of row crop agricultural system, familiarity with finding and analyzing relevant sources, and a little bit on how to analyze costs and benefits. And one of the other resources that I think goes along really well with these conservation case studies, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the tools that are in this, are the Whole Farm Conservation Best Practices Manual. That one's not located at the same site, but is available for download at the ISU Extension and Outreach Extension store. So if you go to the store.extension.iastate.edu, you can download the PDF of this whole manual. And we'll walk through a few of the items that are in this manual, and I'll try to point out when there are some graphics or tables that come from that manual in particular. Okay, so back to the case study. We talked about the introduction and what students should know. Then we step through that case study, there would be a learning objective. So, this one on better utilizing the field edge, identifying edge of field best management practices that could be used, consider the impact on the watershed or field level or watershed level, give a little introduction on the importance of the practice. So in this one, talking about buffers, saturated buffers, bioreactors, oxbows, and we're going to talk mainly about saturated buffers and bioreactors here, but these would be practices that could help us reduce that downstream nitrate delivery. And then the context of thinking about this is part of a case study and part of a farm that we're thinking about trying to reduce downstream nitrate export from. So this is a table, or this is a graphic that comes from that conservation best practices manual, but illustrates the practice performance, or a range of practice performance, or a dial of practice performance associated with these practices. So we can see, as we think about saturated buffers and bioreactors, the research has shown good impact on reducing nitrogen loss, primarily in the nitrate form. You can see that arrow, a strong impact on reducing nitrogen loss, but then low impact on phosphorus. And then if we look at habitat, what other co-benefits we might see, maybe some benefits, or there would be some from our saturated buffer, but really the bioreactor, maybe not much habitat benefit associated with that. We compare that to something like a wetland that, again, has that nitrogen benefit, little benefit on the phosphorus, but then a big benefit on the habitat. So this would be, as we think about a case study and think about practices that we put in, we might be very interested on the nitrogen loss and reducing that, but we might prioritize having some other benefits or other benefits as well. And that's where the kind of graphic like this helps us think about that. Okay, so in these case studies and in the educator booklet, it talks about questions to consider, maybe how the students might work together to think about this problem and think about the conservation practices that could be put in on the land, or there could be suggested modifications for questions that could be used. So as we're thinking about resources that the students would need and walking through this case study, there would be, what additional resources and information do you need to determine what edge of field practice might work on your land? Okay, this is where we'll talk a little bit about some decision trees that we have that I think could help with that. But students should perhaps create a list of information they would use to help determine what conservation practice to use. One might be thinking about, what do we want to reduce? Do we want to reduce nitrogen or phosphorus? If we're thinking about nitrogen and we're thinking about treating water that comes from the tile drainage, then we're probably thinking about saturated buffers and bioreactors.
Hey, Matt, I'm going to interject here real quick. Matt?
Yes. Yep.
So we have a lot of what I would call resource professionals probably listening to this, and maybe not academic teachers or high school teachers. Yep. So student is could be loosely thing. This could be farmers that you are using some of this work on, and workshops, right? Could be modified.
That's exactly right. And actually, we're going to talk about the decision trees that I think could be really helpful, or we would hope that they would be helpful as we think about, for you conservation professionals working with the farmers, about thinking about kind of a simple way to determine like what might be best suited for your land. So it would be kind of a quick way that we might weed out, not spending a lot of time talking about a saturated buffer if a bioreactor is going to work better for your land for various reasons. So that's right. And that's kind of where, what site characteristics are needed. We'll get into a little bit of that. So yeah, students are very broadly, I think as I started looking through these case studies, can be very broadly interpreted. Thank you. Okay, and so there's a whole list of other farm considerations that could be considered as part of this, as we're thinking about what practices we might put in on the land. And so then, for if somebody were using this for, maybe a class, so this would be more in the traditional setting, might think about how this fits in at a watershed scale and how many practices we might need. Would it be possible to meet the goals with just these edge of field practices? So that's maybe not as useful as if we're talking to specific farmers, but it might be, because it might give us an idea of, how many practices would we need of this kind in our watershed. Okay, so one of the things that these case studies have, and I think this could be useful if you're working with individual landowners, is there's a nice short practice in detail description of these practices. So here's a saturated buffer, and kind of what might be the benefit to water quality, the habitat, and then the quality of life, or even what might be some of the management associated with it. So this is in the additional resources for students, but would be just as useful for individual producer that might be thinking about this practice. Okay, and I think probably everybody on this call or this webinar is familiar with the saturated buffer concept, but if there was somebody that isn't, I'm just going to quickly jump through this, that we're thinking about with these saturated buffers that we put a control structure in line, divert a portion of that water flow coming down the drain along the leading edge of the buffer, and trying to promote shallow groundwater flow below the buffer, and specifically nitrate removal as that water moves from the upstream or field edge of the buffer to the stream. Okay, and we're not talking about necessarily high-tech equipment. We're talking about a control structure like you see there. Drain tile that we would put in the ground. So some advantages of this over a bioreactor would be less expensive, less management, because we would not have to do some of the replacement of wood chips like we are likely to need to do with that bioreactor. So less management there. Okay. One of the things that, if you're interested in this, I think there's a very useful tool out there, the Saturated Buffer Viewer, that you can go online. The address is shown there, to look at for individual stream segments whether there's kind of the suitability for a saturated buffer. So I think that's very useful, kind of a first cut on whether a saturated buffer might work on an individual parcel of land. So I've used this many times when either I've been curious on some farms that family has, whether a saturated buffer might work, or when we've gotten some inquiries about specific parcels of ground that a individual producer might be, is interested in a saturated buffer, can pull this up and say, well, that, it doesn't look like it's going to work, or, oh, you might be able to look at it for this site. Okay, as we think about bioreactor, wood chip trench is what I guess I would tend to refer to it as. There is this, again, practice in detail for the bioreactor. We're talking about that wood chip trench that we route a portion of that drainage water through to promote denitrification. So here is just a short video of installing one of those, because once they're in, there's not much to look at. But here you can see filling that big trench with, it's really more than a trench, it's a big pit with wood chips in this case. And then we're going to route that drain flow through there. We're going to line it with some plastic, and we have the feeder tile and collection tile. Feeder tile at the upstream side of the bioreactor, and the collection tile at that downstream side of the bioreactor. Okay. And we've and again, like the saturated buffer, we're putting a control structure in and diverting a portion of the drain flow into that bioreactor. And some advantages of this, it should be adaptable to more sites than saturated buffers, because we don't need to be next to a stream. We can take that water right back into a drainage main. Less area required. So we're talking about pretty small footprint. I mean, it's a big footprint when we think about how many wood chips have to go in there, but it's a relatively small footprint when we think about maybe a field area. So, we might have 1/10 of an acre collecting water from 100 acres or 50 acres. Relatively low maintenance, although at some point in time, we're going to have to replace those wood chips. And so there would be some maintenance. And what I'd say, when I was talking about this yesterday, the question was asked, how long, or the question was, how do we know when the wood chips are not working? That would really be based on some level of monitoring of, are we still getting nitrate removal of that water going through the bioreactor? Are we still getting flow through the bioreactor? We did have one where we had some consolidation of the wood chips, and so we were not getting flow through that bioreactor anymore, and so that had to be replaced. Okay, so this is where the could an edge of field practice work for you? This is getting back to that conservation manual, and I think if you did the case study, this would be a good place to start in thinking about whether what practice might work on that land, or if you're working with individual producers, you might be able to do this. So, thinking about what's our primary goal. If our primary goal is water quality, we might have a host of edge of field practices, wetlands, saturated buffers, bioreactors. If we're thinking about habitat, if that was our goal, is primarily habitat, probably thinking about wetland and saturated buffers. And then just to give a full picture of what's in the decision trees, there is some on water management. But if we're interested in water quality, we'll probably go into that wetland, saturated buffer, or bioreactor. And we'll talk more about the saturated buffer and bioreactor, less about the wetlands as we move forward. Yes, if you were kind of thinking about if we step through this, maybe a first question is, do you have a long-term easement? Are you interested in taking some land out of production, maybe a larger parcel of land for a long-term easement? Then maybe a wetland might work best. But if not, do you have an existing or planned buffer? So, if you're not next to a stream, you don't have an existing buffer or willing to put one in, that would factor in. If you do, then that's saturated buffer. Okay, and so then we would go into the saturated buffer, and then we'll go into the decision tree about whether we think that saturated buffer would work or not for that parcel of land. Okay, all right, but we don't have that buffer, but do you have 0.1 acre near an outlet? If yes, then that bioreactor might work, and we can walk through the next on that. Okay, if no, if you're kind of no from all of these, you don't want to put in a long-term easement, you don't have that existing or planned buffer, and you don't have that 0.1 acre near the outlet, probably then consider alternative practices. Okay, so let's think about, kind of stepping through saturated buffer. Would it be useful for you, or would it work for you? Is there an existing or planned buffer? No. Okay, if no, then consider something alternative. If yes, now, next step might be, are there surface intakes that are leading into the tile drainage that's in that field? Okay. If no, then we probably can go to a saturated buffer and think about that a little bit more, whether that might work. That might be where we then start thinking about going to the saturated buffer viewer to see if the site would, comes up on that, or talking to one of our local professionals. Okay. If we have a surface intake, then there would be a question, are you willing to put in an alternative intake or some other sediment control structure to try to reduce sediment inflow into the tile that gets into, that could get into the tile line and cause any plugging issues? So we've done that. We did that on a site, a bioreactor, so not a saturated buffer, but we did that on a bioreactor with Iowa Soybean Association this last spring up in north central Iowa. There was an intake leading into an existing bioreactor. When we replaced that bioreactor, also put an alternative intake, the gravel and sand intake, rather than that direct pipe to the surface, to try to reduce sediment inflow into that. So in the future, we really probably need to be thinking about that as we think about saturated buffers or bioreactors. And so that could be a step that could throw us out if we're not willing to do that, then we probably have to consider some alternative practice. But if yes, then we could move forward with thinking about that that saturated buffer. Bioreactor, we kind of walk through some of the same things. Again, kind of starting with that is that area available near the outlet. If no, consider something else. If yes, again, asking the question, are there surface intakes? If yes, again, kind of going back to this, are we willing to put in some alternative or some type of sediment control system? If no, then consider something alternative. But if yes, then the next question would be, is the drainage outlet 10 inches or less? Or in a sense, how much land area are we draining? A bit of a concern if we had something very large, 10 inches or more, we're probably going to have to do something special with the design of that bioreactor to minimize short circuiting of flow. So it may not be as cost effective. So just something to think about that, this is a practice, both saturated buffers and bioreactors, maybe a practice that works best on, that kind of field scale system, not necessarily a drainage district scale. If we get to that what I would call drainage district scale, bigger tile lines, we might be thinking more about a wetland in that case. Although, 10-inch tile isn't necessarily drainage district scale, that could be a big field, but we may not be as conducive for the bioreactor, or we have to do more with the engineering and design of that bioreactor. But if it's less than that 10-inch, then we can ask about that bioreactor and work with some of the local professionals. If not, then would you be open to the alternative designs? Again, think in Minnesota, they put one in on a 700-acre drainage area, but there's multiple bioreactors in that system to try to prevent. If we put in something that's 100-foot wide, 100-foot long, we might be concerned about short circuiting of flow through that type of system. But if you're not, then we'd consider or need to do something alternative. Okay. Otherwise, yes, ask about that bioreactor. Okay, so getting back to kind of that case study and just talking through what some of the other resources are there. It gives you some information about established practices on an ISU farm within this watershed, this Big Creek watershed in this case. And so there's information about the specific practices that are actually installed there. So you can get a little more information about these edge of field practices and kind of see how, at least on one farm, these practices went in. Also in that supplemental information for students, there is listing of suggested resources. So a lot more information about all of these different practices so that people can familiarize themselves with all of the information out there. It doesn't have links or information to detailed research publications, but more extension type publications that hopefully give folks a good idea of these practices, some of the background and how they may work, and as well as some of the maintenance that might be involved associated with them. So, thinking about how this might fit into a curriculum, probably for applied courses where there is some introductory knowledge, students studying ag or environmental science. So, again, this slide's more for, maybe a more traditional side, high school, community college, or undergrad or graduate student type situations. So what you'll find if you go into the links for the training within the Conservation Learning Group website, you'll find educator resources, so the instructor agenda, the overview booklet, some slides if somebody wants to do a presentation about these practices and the case studies. There's better utilizing the field edge instructor slides. Also, since when Kay talked, Ann Stout put together kind of how these might fit in with the Iowa Core and some of those areas. So that's in the educator resources category. On the student resources, document on the overview booklet, additional information booklet, and then also some information on a tool, the nutrient tracking tool that was used to estimate the performance of some of these practices. The nutrient tracking tool is a resource out there that folks could use to estimate the impact of some of these practices on reducing downstream nitrate loss. It's a tool developed by USDA NRCS in collaboration with Tarleton State University down in Texas, uses the Apex model on the back end to predict some of these practice performance impact on a field scale. Okay, again, just to go back, that these case studies are on the conservationlearninggroup.org website, the training tab there, and for educators, there's the various watershed case studies that I think I mentioned before, but we have in the field, redefining the field edge, better utilizing the field edge that I tried to talk about, wetlands and wildlife that Dr. Kay Stefanik and Dr. Adam Janke talked about a few weeks ago, and the top one in the field that Dr. Mark Licht talked about. And Dr. Licht, I believe, will be talking about redefining the field edge here in the future. Maybe Liz will be able to tell us what that date is and if I got that right. I might have gotten it wrong, but I think that's right. Okay, with that, hopefully we can have some questions and dialogue about this or about these practices in general. If you watch this webinar, you earned and need a CCA CEU. Get your information to Liz Ripley, ejukums@iastate.edu by today at 5 o'clock. If you need a CCA CEU and you had to listen to me, you better get that in today. So get that into Liz today, ejukums@iastate.edu. And all right, I get the great pleasure of introducing what will be the topic next week. Hopefully I'll be back in my normal position as the host, moderator rather than the speaker, which as I said, I like better. But we get to hear Dr. Amy Toth talk about, can prairie habitat in the farm-dominated landscape of Iowa benefit bees and beekeepers? I'm going to put a little plug in. I just got some honey the other day from the Prairie Strips Project, so that'll be great to hear from Dr. Toth. So, Jackie,
okay,
back to you.
Yeah, hey, I'll be happy when you're back in this seat also, because you do a much better job at this than I do. So we have actually had a lot of questions come in while you were talking. I'm going to say one is like a bigger picture question, so I'm going to hold that one, but let's get to just like some of the detailed ones, like what is the waste product that bioreactors create?
What's the waste product that bioreactors create? Okay. So we're converting, we're utilizing the carbon in the wood chips for our benefit for the denitrification cycle. So when and I was on site when we dug up one of these bioreactors up in north central Iowa, and it almost looked like a little bit of a composted material, kind of a little composted in wood chips. So it was not. It was a material that landowner was able to lightly apply with a manure spreader onto the crop field. So it wasn't wasn't anything that we're really concerned about with a hazardous waste. And so it was really just decomposed wood decomposed wood that was lightly applied out in the field. So it was not and again, it is a lot of wood chips when we think about putting it in that trench. But if we think about applying it back onto a field where there's a lot of residue cover, it's not a lot of material, if that makes sense.
Okay. So two people want to know if the saturated buffer tool is just Iowa specific, or it is just Iowa specific, but is there any work being done to make this tool available to other regional states?
Yes, I would have to think it is just Iowa specific. And I was kind of doing a little searching today to see if I did not find anything else for other states, but yes, I think that is likely something that they would be looking at and hopefully done. The tool that was used to help develop this was ACPF, Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework. And they are really expanding that tool, expanding use of that tool across the Midwest. So I think that hopefully there'll be more of that for other states into the future.
Okay, so how are those different decision tools developed and who is involved? Like, why should we listen to it?
Oh, okay. Well,
is this just your opinion, or is this other people?
No. Okay, so that's a good point. I should pull up the other slide. Okay, so those decision tools, we had a meeting, or what we called a summit, of some contractors, ag drainage professionals from Ag Drainage Management Coalition, drainage engineers. Chris Hay and I kind of helped lead that discussion. So we tried to talk through what are the this wasn't to help do a final design, okay? Because some of these practices are going to have a professional engineer. But could you walk through these decision trees and get an idea of, will this practice perhaps work on my farm? Won't it? And get some preliminary information. So it was those professionals. So it wasn't just my professional judgment. It was a collective group of folks that came together to look at this. As I said, some drainage engineers, drainage contractors, drainage industry, and then some academics, and NRCS was there too.
Okay,
and IDALs. Yep.
Yeah, so we're going to go to the question I think is a larger discussion that somebody asked. And basically, this person just came from a North Central Region NACD meeting. And one of the topics that came up informally from other states and on the part of like several people is they're having trouble creating interests for saturated buffers or bioreactors in their area. Do we have any ideas on how they might promote them? Iowa might be slightly ahead of some of the other states with both those practices, since they both kind of originate out of here. But do you have any ideas? What's been our secret sauce here in Iowa to start getting people to discuss these?
I'm an ag engineer. Don't ask me about that secret sauce for that. But I can.
Oh, come on.
That's Matt. I know.
You're better at this than just don't pull that engineering card.
Okay. No. That's a great question. I mean, because I think we have gained some interest in Iowa, but we still, it's not like everywhere. It's not like every potential saturated buffer site, a landowner's going in and asking about that. So I think there's a lot of work that we still need to do. But I think that, there's probably been some unifying dialogue around the importance of these edge of field practices, from the state, from extension, from, some of our farm media, so if we look back at even things like the, Wallace's Farmer articles that we've written with the learning farms, there's been, quite a bit of information that people kind of know about these practices. So I think that's been pretty unifying. And then I think there have been some efforts in certain areas, in certain watersheds or, blitz projects of really intense marketing around these practices. I think, to me, we have to build the awareness that there's a problem. And I think we're still need to do more of that, but we're getting there. Then, what are the solutions? And then, if people do hear consistently about these edge of field practices, I think we build more interest for them. And then I think field day, getting people out to see some of these, or getting people to see, a lot of these are buried, right, Jackie? And so, even things like the trailer, that the conservation systems on the edge trailer, maybe helped a little bit in getting people raising awareness and understanding of these practices.
Yeah, so I would also say that INRC is funding a project that's going to try to get a handle on what people are thinking and feeling about edge of field practices, right?
Yep.
Okay, so yep. So we need more research too, to actually understand what are the barriers, what are the resistance to it. And I think we know from past research that some of the barriers are that water quality just doesn't stand out as urgent in terms of being willing to do a practice like this that doesn't seem to benefit them. So maybe we could get a wildlife benefit to some of these practices, and that will help promote it. Okay, we got a bunch of other questions coming in.
Okay.
If the majority of runoff is occurring on frozen ground, will this affect how we proceed?
And so if the runoff is happening on frozen ground, so one of the things is that, these are for treating tile drainage water. So water that's, infiltrating through the system and coming out the tile line for nitrate. In general, that's our biggest transport pathway of subsurface flow, whether it be natural subsurface flow or artificial subsurface flow is the most dominant pathway of nitrogen and in the nitrate form. And so, these are going to treat that drainage water. They can still work in cold conditions, but you would have to get the nitrate to them. So if the soil's frozen and you're not getting infiltration water and drain flow, you're not going to be delivering nitrate through that transport pathway. These systems can work in cool conditions, although the denitrification cycle does slow down at cold conditions.
Okay, do waste products, and that's in quote, of bioreactors also include dissolved organics, N2O and CH4?
Yeah, so that's a good, okay, I see Bill added that. That's I'd say that is an area where we need to continue research work. So, and also, so there's been some of that work done, and actually we could have, as I said, maybe somebody from Dr. Sapir's group or Morgan Davis once did some work on N2O. And so, yeah, with the denitrification cycle, you may see some N2O emissions like you would with some of the other denitrification practices, but put in context, if that was denitrified in the stream, downstream, it may not be as bad as that. So certainly something that we need to continue to do some work on. I'd put out there, there's been some slight work done on methyl mercury, but Dr. Crumpton had a graduate student, Dr. Casey Judge, or soon to be Dr. Casey Judge, did some work on methyl mercury production from wetlands. And we talked about in the defense the need to continue to do some work on things like bioreactors, about if we get any methanogenesis and methyl mercury coming out. There's still a need to continue some of that research. So it's not all, there's still research needs in these areas.
Okay, do you see the phosphorus removal system, NRCS code 782, being added to the suite of edge of field practices?
I think that perhaps, and we're going to, I know Dr. Chad Penn with USDA ARS has done a lot of work with P filters. And so I would, he might be somebody that we get for a webinar to talk a little more about that, because I think that is something to be considered into the future. I'm not an expert in knowing exactly how they would fit in within the bioreactor system, but I do think that in the future we're going to need to be thinking about dissolved P a little bit more. I'll put in a little plug. Dr. Penn is going to talk at the Iowa Nutrient Research Center seminar. He's going to talk in April at our seminar series about some of the dissolved P structures, but that'll be a more extended research discussion. But we could think about him for a webinar as well in the future.
So is there any publication or other resource available on what geospatial data is needed for methodology applied to create a suitable tool for saturated buffers and wood chip bioreactors?
Yeah, okay, so I think so, because I think within the ACPF tool, there's likely some information on what's used for citing of those practices. So I think that I don't have it on my fingertips, but I think that one would be able to look at what criteria was utilized in developing those tools. Yep.
Okay. Any other questions out there? Nope. But I don't know. Did you get any directly, Matt?
There was one. There was a question about what I mean by surface intakes when I talked about that, and I was just thinking of in that case, the direct pipe that's coming up to the surface in a depressional area or in a road ditch that that would take that water right down to our artificial subsurface drainage system. A lot of times you'll see it as orange or yellow out in the field, or a small beehive. That's what I'm thinking there. And there was a question about, with bioreactors, do you prefer to cap them or leave them open on the top? I'll just say in Iowa, they primarily have been capped with about a foot of soil. In Illinois, many of them have not had a cap on them. And I think Laura Christensen, they may be doing some work to analyze some that have cap and without, specifically for any gas emissions off those. But I will have to recognize I don't have that answer on that. But and I think that would be, I'll look forward to seeing more of that information. Maybe it's been published and I am not as up on my literature as I should be. But in Iowa, they primarily have been capped.
Okay, well, Dr.
But what I would say, can I say one last thing? So just, we do want to try to make sure we don't put maybe too much soil over them. One of the bioreactors that I mentioned that was replaced had about 3 or 4 foot of overburden over those wood chips. And I think that helped. Well, I think that led to kind of compressing or consolidating those wood chips so that we couldn't get water flow through them. Actually, we have a virtual field day about that, about replacing that. So I'll put a little plug in there. You can kind of see some video footage. And if you want to see what those wood chips look like after about 10 years, you could go to that virtual field day. That's on the Iowa Learning Farms. The link would be on the Iowa Learning Farms website.
Okay, any summarizing comments you want to make about the whole case studies and why we did it, why did we do these, and what are we hoping for with them?
Well, I think it's hopefully to, one of the things, I think the case studies can be useful as well in in helping education, maybe about high school, community college, even some college students, helping them understand these practices and how they might fit in a little bit better. Because we talk in generalities about what to put a bioreactor in, put a saturated buffer in. Maybe, walking through these case studies helps, give a little bit more, it helps one understand it a little bit. Yeah, paint a picture. There we go. Like a picture's worth 1,000 words, a visual, learning of, and so I think that's one of the reasons, with the decision trees, it was, in a way, it's to help people think about what might work on their land and maybe zeroing in on this. And I'll tell the example, I've gotten a call before about from Southern Iowa or Southwest Iowa, and they said, well, I have a tile inlet intake terrace. I want to put in a bioreactor. Well, that's probably not land that's well suited for a bioreactor. A few things. One is it may have a surface intake. 2 is it may primarily be collecting surface runoff, which is low in nitrate, so probably not much nitrate. And so, some of these tools might help you, weed out that, okay, actually I need a different practice. I need to look at a different practice than a saturated buffer or bioreactor. So that's one thing that I think those the decision tools might help somebody do.
Okay, so Reed let us know that Laura is doing some work on emissions with and without a soil calc and bioreactors. Don't think it's published, so I think she's still working on it.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that Reed didn't say, Laura published on it 2 years ago, Matt. You should be up on your literature. So
okay, Dr. Helmers, thank you for your time. I can't wait for you to get back in your seat because you do it better.
Can't either.
And let's just plug Amy's one more time. Next week, Amy Toth is very, very engaging speaker, and I think that's going to be a great talk.
All right. Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in today.